Magandang hapon muli, no? Salamat. Okay. It is a little difficult to speak at this time, ano? Medyo marami na kayong medyo late na in the afternoon at marami na ring napag-usapan siguro. But nevertheless, we had been assigned to share with you or perhaps review with you, refresh our minds on the CCAM-DRR Program Convergence Budgeting Resiliency Program. Next slide, please. And as I do that, I like to, next slide please. As I do that, I like to discuss briefly the Resiliency Program, what it is, what are its objectives, and then preparations for RRP PCB for fiscal year 2022, what are the DBM budget directives for 2023, what are our priority needs for 2023 at the CCAM-DRR cabinet cluster, and then finally, breeze you through how to fill up the PCB forms 1 and BP202A, and what are the ways forward and timelines. Next slide, please. Okay, I think this is really just a review, no? But just in case there are some people new in our group, next slide, please. The RRP really talks about the scope of the government's climate change and disaster response has been further defined and expanded across agencies when in 2017, Executive Order number 24 has been issued, reorganizing the cabinet cluster system, one of which is the climate change adaptation and mitigation cluster that have in 2017 been reorganized and renamed to be CCAM-DRR. The disaster risk reduction portion added to the cluster. This has likewise expanded the cluster memberships, and the CCAM-DRR cabinet cluster pushed the national government's agenda on adaptation and resilience, delivered the national vision on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. And as you know, this is just a review of what is the CCAM-DRR roadmap for 2018 to 2022. In fact, as we are ending the map duration, for this year already, we're wrapping up to finalize the terms of reference for the updating of the roadmap into the next term. The roadmap talks about our overall goal of establishing climate and disaster resilient communities, supporting equitable and sustainable development, and in terms of desired result, it envisions that by this year that we would have enhanced climate and disaster resilient communities in the 24 climate vulnerable areas and in the 4 major urban centers of Metro Manila, Metro Cebu, Metro Iloilo, and Metro Davao. And therefore, these are the 24 climate vulnerable provinces and the 4 major urban areas are likewise the priority target sites, geographical focus that we also want our cabinet cluster member agencies to prioritize on as you prepare for your budget proposals for 2023 and the forward estimates. Under the roadmap, our 4 major outcome objectives are outcome objective 1 of increasing the adaptive capacities of vulnerable communities, outcome objective 2 of ensuring adequate supply of clean air, water, and other natural resources. Outcome 3 of increasing resilience of critical infrastructure, our energy infrastructure, our roads and bridges, our health infrastructure, and our other critical infrastructure. And a cross-cutting one, outcome 4 is enhancing knowledge, access to information, and institutional capacities. Next slide, please. The priority climate vulnerable provinces that I mentioned earlier are listed on this screen. They are provinces that have been so identified and chosen because they have high susceptibility to climate hazards. They're likewise situated in critical watershed areas. They are with high poverty incidence, and therefore these 24 provinces have been so divided according to the year timeline such that in 2020 we started dwelling on the first 8 provinces in 2021, we added on another set of provinces, but we continued on with work with the first 8 provinces until in 2022 this year. We're hoping that we can be doing interventions in the 24 climate vulnerable provinces, and that even for 2023, we hope to be able to still continue work on them. Because as we know, even as we lined them up, there had been a number of difficulties, and therefore it was not really also easy to have the agencies of the cabinet cluster take on programs into these priority climate vulnerable provinces. But for 2023 budget proposal preparation, we re-emphasize, as we keep telling our member agencies, that we like ourselves to focus our limited budgetary resources to areas that will have more higher impact and where they are more needed by our country, and they are the climate vulnerable provinces and urban areas. Next slide, please. And the RRP is indeed our country's convergence program of the CCAM-DRR cabinet cluster to aid in strengthening the resiliency of natural ecosystems and even increasing the adaptive capacities of our vulnerable communities to short and long-term risks. And more broadly, our RRP is designed to strengthen the climate change response in line with our policies contained in our Ambition 2040, in the Philippine Development Plan, in the National Climate Change Action Plan, and even in the National Framework Strategy on Climate Change. Next slide, please. And the RRP would have a number of legal bases as follows. The National Budget Memorandum issued in 2013, the CCAM Cluster Resolution issued in 2014, the Executive Order 24 issued in 2017 that has expanded the cluster members to include disaster risk reduction component, and even the Cabinet Cluster Resolution number 1 that has already adopted the CCAM-DRR roadmap, and then the 2019 issuance of the Cabinet Cluster that adopted the guidance document for the RRP for 2020 to 2022, and even National Budget Memoranda. And one of them is the 2019 issuance that directed the institutionalization of the Program Convergence Budgeting in the budget process, and that the budget proposals of agencies like what we're having now on RRP require DNR endorsement, DNR being the chair to the cabinet cluster. Next slide, please. So what we see here is just as a figure to describe the evolution of the RRP, beginning from the earlier years of 2013, when we, at that time, we still was referring to PCB, the earlier term was for program budgeting approach, until there were developments over the years until the EO 2017 that expanded the cluster membership. Even in 2018 was the first time we have started to envision including sub-national agencies or our provincial local governments in our RRP interventions until we started the implementation with the provincial governments beginning 2020. Next slide, please. Okay, so indeed the RRP seeks to help government optimally use our available budget on priority CCAM-DRR concerns, knowing that there is limited fiscal space, and therefore you wanted to be increasing the size and quality of CCAM-DRR investments with convergence amongst the various agencies of the CCAM-DRR cabinet cluster. Next slide, please. What we see here is a matrix that briefly describes investment portfolio for risk resilience that had been developed first for the first 8 provinces that are priority geographic focus of the cabinet cluster. And what you see here is that the investment portfolio for risk resilience has identified the various climate vulnerabilities and disaster vulnerabilities of the provinces And therefore, having done so, what are adaptation options? What are programs that the provinces will be needing so that it may be able to help reduce the climate and disaster vulnerabilities? And then, and therefore, those are what we hope can be picked up by the agencies in terms of their proposals for the coming year, what were not yet included from those that were earlier identified by our provinces in association with the cluster agencies at the national and at the regional level. This IPRR matrix likewise tells us what are the contributions to the RRP indicators that particular program or project will do, who are the lead agencies and other implementers, and what are the costs of the project. Next slide, please. Okay. We see here are the forms that will have to be filled up for RRP submissions. No? We have BP, we have RRP PCB form 1, as you see here on the leftmost side, and a BP form 202A on the rightmost side. Next slide, please. We see here would be the amounts that had been approved under the 2022 RRP within the budget of expenditure and sources of financing issued by the Department of Budget and Management for 2022, and this amounts to 284.48 billion pesos. And therefore, we see here your various departments are included, and and it likewise shows on the last column what were approved in your department under the Risk Resiliency Program. Next slide, please. Okay. So as we prepare for our Risk Resiliency Budget Program Convergence Budgeting for 2023, next slide, please. These are some of the budget and DBM directives that we got. Okay, so one is there was an issuance of National Budget Memorandum 142 in January 12 of this year, and it has defined the two-tier budgeting approach, the cost-based budgeting system as directed in 2019. It likewise mentioned about program convergence budgeting, including RRP, and also the implementation of the Mandanas-Garcia case Supreme Court ruling. The budget priorities framework, as we were told during our PCB-RRP workshop some days ago, was announced to us by USEC Toledo as something that has not yet been issued, but it will be issued likely on the second quarter of this year to provide further guidelines on the available fiscal space and spending priorities. Next slide, please. So in terms of submissions of the BP Form 202A, Convergence Programs and Projects, the form shall indicate the program description and objectives, the funding requirements, net of personal services, and physical targets and accomplishments. And therefore, there will be portions on the 2021, the actual obligations incurred. For 2022, what are in the General Appropriations Act for 2022. And then for 2023, what are our proposed programs indicating the Tier 1 and Tier 2 components. And then forward estimates for 2024 to 2025 total proposals. And then the intended strategies to achieve the targeted outputs will also be included, as well as proposed measures to address issues gaps that shall be declared in the BP form. For this year's 2023 budget preparation, we are told that our BP Form 202 shall be submitted on or before May 31 to the DBM to the OSDPS. However, for us at the Cabinet Cluster, we have to review them, consolidate them, and make a consolidated submission for the cluster to the DBM. Therefore, we are urging an earlier deadline of May 31 because we will still have a technical review committee to review agency submissions and also a consolidation work that will have to be done through the cluster chair, which is the DNR. Next slide, please. And in terms of another feature from the DBM directive, we're told that in 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that the just share of LGUs from the national taxes shall include collections from BIR and other collecting agencies. The national tax allotments for fiscal year 2022 amounted to some $1 billion of pesos, and this is equivalent to a 38% increase from 2021 era shares. And therefore, with increased LGU shares, the national government agencies should refrain, we are told by DBM, from duplicating the delivery of devolved functions and services with the local government units. Instead, the national government agencies had been directed by the DBM to focus on steering, capacitating, and monitoring the LGUs. Next slide, please. Okay. After we would have discussed what had been the DBM 2023 budget directives, now we are prepared to discuss what are our priority needs for fiscal year 2023 that we hope our member agencies of the cluster will focus on when you do your 2023 budget proposals. And as we talk about this, we talk of 4 priority concerns. One is on the IATF priorities, the Interagency Task Force for Emerging Infectious Diseases, strategies and priorities identified in the We Recover as One report. And then the second one is our priority within the cluster for pursuing a water secure and resilient Philippines. Third would be key programs and projects that are under the Task Force Build Back Better executive order issuance from the President and their priority sites. And here we talk about a TFBB1 that talks about 3 priority areas heavily devastated from typhoons Rolly and Ulysses in November of 2020. And also we talk about regions that had been heavily devastated also. The higher devastated ones from Typhoon ODETTE of December 2021. And finally, we talk about other potential interventions linked to recovery and risk resilience investments. Next. Okay. Therefore, what are the priorities from the Interagency Task Force for the management of emerging infectious diseases? In fact, in 2021, the budget priorities framework merely dwelt on the priority focus for COVID-19 priority areas of concern. What are these? Next slide, please. A priority concern within the IATF that is related to the CCAM-DRR cabinet cluster would be ensuring water security, especially in COVID-19 pandemic areas. Concerns to accelerate the provision of water supply and sanitation to improve access to safe and adequate water. The concern to enhance water conservation and efficiency measures to avert water shortages. And the concern to develop and implement the national roadmap for water security. Next. Another IATF priority area would be the need to streamline the management of healthcare waste, personal protective equipment, our face masks and others, and infectious waste, especially at the household and community levels. And also, the need to implement ancillary remedial actions to improve environmental health and mitigate climate change. Another priority area of concern, next slide please, under the IATF would be the need to prioritize protection and conservation of natural resources, especially in degradation hotspots and critical ecosystems. Here we would note that there are areas where we need to intensify surveillance and enforcement activities to protect wildlife and their habitats, particularly as we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has really come from the zoonotic the zoonotic areas where we had been remiss in the areas to really provide the appropriate surveillance and enforcement to protect wildlife and their habitats. Another area of concern would be research and development on utilizing natural resources for disease prevention and cure. So this is to be preventing other pandemics or other disease outbreaks, and regular sanitation of public places such as wet markets, parks, and informal settlements. Next slide, please. Still from the IATF priorities would be the need to next slide, please. The need to have capacity and needs assessment of healthcare facilities. The need to assess existing technologies and processes on waste storage and treatment to manage new viruses. And the concern to have early detection and rapid response to manage new viruses and other organisms and their relationships to the environment. Next slide, please. Still, other areas under priority under the IATF we recover as one report would be the need for agroforestry development programs in COVID-19 affected rural communities to support food production and watershed protection, because many of our country persons have experienced livelihood losses. There's also need to heighten our programs on biodiversity friendly and sustainable alternative livelihood programs, and also the need to protect forests and pursue reforestation, watershed rehabilitation, and management activities. Next slide, please. And a final priorities area within the CCAM-DRR from the IATF we recover as one report is, well, the need to implement water conservation and efficiency measures. They need to implement water demand management program, information education campaigns on water conservation in traditional and social media platforms, and even the need to increase and update existing data infrastructure in the National Disaster and Risk Reduction Management Operations Center. So that completes the IATF priorities that we hope our member agencies can consider in your 2023 budget proposal preparation. A second area of concern would be our theme, our continuing theme of focus on water security and resiliency concerns. Next slide, please. In an ASEAN Water Development Outlook document with policy recommendations in 2020 for strategic directions to work for a water secure and resilient Asia and the Pacific, the above mentioned policy levers had been identified, and we see that our member agencies of the cluster could be, and we hope would be, engaging your proposals in this direction also. Concerns on engaging vulnerable people in decision making. These are concerns for our DSWD and the Philippine Commission on Women. The need to invest in human resources capacity for household water security for the DA and the DTI. The need to develop locally appropriate solutions from the Office of Civil Defense. The need to enhance water resources monitoring, measurement, and data availability with our water agencies like the River Basin Control Office of the DNR, the National Water Resources Board, and the DOST. The need to improve water productivity from the RBCO and NWRB also. The need to ensure adequate storage and distribution mechanism. Promoting integrated water resources management with our NWRB. Investing in climate adaptation and resilient measures with our OCD and DPWH. With our LUA and MWSS agencies, there's need to invest in sanitation, wastewater treatment, and circular economy. Improving water cost effectiveness and affordability, and improving drainage security. These are concerns with our agencies of NWRB, MWSS, and DPWH. Next slide, please. In terms of household water security and increasing thereof, these different policy recommendations had been put forward with our EMD and the LUA needing to improve pollution load management and stimulate circular economic activities, increasing the protection of our natural ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems with with our bureaus, FMB, BMB, and the local water utilities authority. The need to promote integrated flood risk management, including the piloting of nature-based solutions that includes the DPWH and even our BMP and ERDB that will highlight on nature-based solutions in integrated flood risk management. And then the need to improve data collection, modeling, and associated system for preventive disaster risk management, and this could be pursued by our Office of Civil Defense, DOST, and even ERDB. The need to reduce groundwater depletion with MGB and other vulnerability and sustainability assessment programs of our water resources, and even for our water-contained areas with the NWRB and the MGB. Next slide, please. Okay. Then we talk about community livelihood and enterprise continuity programs with the SWD and with the DAR, and the need to inculcate climate and disaster resilience consciousness in our communities. And this we will talk about DILG, and then our flood forecasting and warning program with DOST Pag-asa, and even our National Agricultural, Aquatic and Natural Resource Sector program with DOST, particularly RTCAR. Next. And then rehabilitating our pumping stations, dredging, declogging, and desilting of waterways in Metro Manila. Both of these are MMDA concerns. And then the need to promote cost-effective renewable energy and alternative fuels with Department of Energy. And then our agricultural machinery, equipment, and facilities infrastructure program with the Department of Agriculture. And the need to expand and retrofit our rainwater harvesting facilities with the Department of Agriculture. Next. Okay, still the flood management programs with the DPWH, also the need to expand on our sewerage and septage management program with DPWH, and then rainwater collection systems is likewise being pursued by DPWH, and mapping of houses, communities in hazard areas in the cities and those that are affected by droughts and even by other disasters by the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development. Next slide, please. Okay. So that covers our second sources of priority concerns, the water security and resiliency theme and focus of our concerns. A third source of our priority focus, but we hope can likewise be considered in our budget proposal for 2023 preparations, would be the priorities under the task force Build Back Better. Next slide, please. Yeah. In 2020, particularly November 18 of 2020, the President issued an executive order strengthening the rehabilitation and recovery of efforts in typhoon hit areas through the creation of Build Back Better Task Force. And under this executive order, it is the DNR Secretary that chairs it and co-chaired by the Secretary of the Department of Public Works and Highways. The task force is directed to expedite, lead the implementation and monitoring of the post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation efforts of the national government in typhoon-affected areas. So we emphasize here post-disaster recovery efforts. Next slide, please. And the task force has created 6 key result areas that are likewise headed by the concerned lead agencies of the CCAM-DRR cluster. And first in the key result area working group would be better and resilient infrastructure that will dwell on the roads and bridges, the dams, and other areas with concerns for dredging and desilting. And this is led by the Department of Public Works and Highways. KRA2 is headed by the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development,
And this is on stronger shelter and resilient settlements, where there are concerns for financial assistance to areas been that had settlements that had been shelters that had been totally destroyed, or those that are partially destroyed. This would likewise dwell on relocation for poor households exposed with climate change related hazards, and even concerns of the safe evacuation facilities are also a concern here. The third KRA working group is on improved systems and essential services, the lifelines. And this is being led by the Office of Civil Defense. The fourth KRA working group is on restored sustainable livelihood, headed by the Department of Trade and Industry, where our community-based enterprises will be part of this. Climate resilient agriculture and fisheries cottage-based industries would likewise be part of this. Our fifth KRA is being led by the Department of Interior and Local Government, and this is on strengthened governance through broad-based citizen input. And finally, 6 KRA working group is led by the DNR and is named the Intensified Environment and Natural Resources Management KRA. Next slide, please. Next slide. And here we see the different member agencies that are part of each of the KRA. Okay, so government-wide, we see that our various CCAM-DRR agencies are distributed into the 6 KRA working groups of the Task Force Build Back Better. Next slide, please. Okay. For what are the priority geographic focus of the TFBB? We call a TFBB1 that focuses on the priority geographical focus just when the executive order was issued. And at that time in November, Cagayan River Basin and areas of Marikina and also of Bicol River Basin had been so devastated by typhoons Rolly and Ulysses. Next slide, please. And then we talk about a TFBB2, where in December of 2021, several regions had been harder hit, and they are the 6 harder hit regions here: Caraga, Region 7, Region 8, Region 6, Region 10, and Mimaropa. And this comprise now the TFBB2, or the second set of priority major focus areas of the Task Force Build Back Better. In Surigao, for instance, in Dinagat Islands, where several houses had been totally destroyed, a number likewise partially destroyed, and the areas heavily devastated. These are now the priority areas of focus of TFBB2. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we want to know what are examples of KRA programs that should be considered in our 2023 budget proposal preparation, example for KRA 1, if you're a member agency to this, or if you are lead agency to this, then programs that will dwell on repairing roads and bridges, including drainage systems and road slopes affected by the disaster, concerns to address perennial flooding and storm surge, the need for resilient evacuation centers and government buildings are concerns that have to be funded under this KRA. Still possible recovery resilience investments under this KRA would be repair and rehabilitation of damaged infrastructures, roads and bridges, flood management program, the need to dredge or desilt, and building program. Next slide, please. For KRA2, if your agency leads this, if you are DSHUD, or if your agency are a member to this KRA2, then these are the POPs concerns that have to be included in your 2023 budget proposal. Displaced families affected by disasters, informal settlement families that are affected, living in high-risk areas and they had to leave the high-risk area and they're advised to no longer return there because they're dangerous and high-risk areas. They have to be addressed in the programs. Likewise, financial assistance that have to be given to families with totally devastated shelter, or those even with partially devastated shelter, have to be put in our budget proposals. The need to construct climate and disaster resilient settlement housing units, and even Evacuation facilities that are more resilient are areas of need here. Next slide, please. If you're a member agency to KRA3, either you're the OCT which is lead to this or a member agency to this, these are program concerns that have to be funded. Disaster response operations, developing impact mitigation plans, and revisiting the DRR management plans, improving on our forecasting tools or our early warning devices and their implications into local database and monitoring, localizing weather forecasting and early warning systems, our installation of disaster resilient communication infrastructure, ensuring availability and adequacy of key lifelines and basic needs. These are our various program concerns that could be funded, that could be put into our proposal for 2023. Next, if you are the DTI that is lead to this, or if you're a member of the DTI in this, if you're a member agency to the KRA4 led by the DTI, these are program concerns that have to be funded. Early recovery of poor, low-income families in the informal sector, the need to address the damages to micro enterprises and cooperatives, damages also incurred by the social and medium enterprises cooperatives, even damages to agribusinesses. As such, there are programs that have to be highlighted and in fact supported even more, like livelihood assistance grants, pangkabuhayan sa pagbangon at ginhawa, gulayan sa pamayanan kontra COVID-19, provision of livelihood assistance to the Integrated Livelihood Program and Bamboo Industry Development Program are a number of areas of program to dwell on. Next, if you are DILG, next, or that is lead to this KRA working group, or if you're a member agency to this working group, KRA5, these are the program concerns that you have to put in the budgetary proposal for 2023. The need to update local plans that ensures integration of the DRR and CCAM components. The need to update hazard, land cover, land use and resource, and other related maps. The need to pursue training and capacity building to local government units in the areas of concern of comprehensive land use plan, zoning ordinances, local climate change action plan, climate and disaster risk assessment, and even continuing IEC campaigns on existing hardships in the communities are areas of concern to fund with our budget proposals. Next slide, please. Okay, so this, if you're the DNR that leads this, or if you're a member agency to the DNR member agency to the KRA6 that leads this KRA on intensified environment and natural resources management, these are program areas of concern that may find themselves featuring in your budget proposal 2023. Upland reforestation and river stabilization programs, access to clean and potable water supply, bamboo propagation, identification and construction of site for check dams, installation and installation of automated weather stations, planting of climate resilient species of bamboo or mangroves, our mangrove rehabilitation program, inventory and mapping of water resources and users, and even construction of small water impounding systems and rainwater harvesting facilities are all found in this KRA6. Next. And then we talk about other potential interventions linked to recovery and risk resilience investments. Next. The need, if you're a shelter agency, the need to support recycling of materials and access to durable housing solutions, activating finance and insurance schemes, reviewing existing LGU shelter plans, and conducting planning for resilient settlements to use improved standards, adopting green, inclusive, and resilient principles in urban and land use planning, zoning, safe and affordable housing, and social protection are all parts of the long-term resiliency recovery strategies under the shelter program. Next. And under infrastructure, we need to be able to have energy disruption forecasts using renewable energy, rechargeable systems, and emergency communication systems, The need to plan for resilient and green infrastructure, including considerations for nature-based approaches and integration into local and ecosystem-based plans. Next. There are also infrastructure short-term reconstruction that we have to be also having in mind. Infrastructure that is at substantial risk of being damaged then would need to be rebuilt only if it can be done in a way to reduce their vulnerability. And then the need to consider resilience and accessibility of infrastructure during or after disaster, particularly for infrastructure like the health sector, the hospitals, the health centers, then our shelters and food distribution mechanisms. Next slide, please. In terms of medium-term investments for infrastructure, we could consider nature-based solutions as a first priority, followed by soft infrastructure or gray infrastructure as a last resort. And therefore, we don't just talk now of just gray infrastructure, but the need to dwell on green-gray infrastructure as a medium-term investment. We also need to implement measures that will generate employment and economic activity. We will also need to expand investments in green and resilient infrastructure and industrial development, applying nature-based solutions, circular economy, and smart city development approaches. Next slide, please. And then in the environment sector, we talk a lot about with Typhoon Odette happening and devastating many regions in the country. Now more than ever, we see the need for detailed damage assessment to be done in terms of ecosystems and including urban environment, coastal habitats damage, and natural coastal buffer rehabilitation. There are also some shelter belt plantations that had been pursued in some programs. Green-gray coastal resiliency measures are also important. And water resources pollution assessment among them. Next slide, please. And then Typhoon Odette was also a lesson to us in terms of assessing the coastal habitats damage and natural coastal buffer rehabilitation. Since rehabilitation of the Typhoon Odette harder hit regions will take a while, including this in our budget proposals will also be an important element. Next slide, please. Shelter belt plantations is a nature-based solution. It could be considered in many of our program areas. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And even the need to have appropriate trees along roads, near buildings, with deep rooting, small canopies, or other programs that may have to figure in our budget proposals. Next slide, please. We cannot just overemphasize, next slide please, the need for effective watershed management in improving the resilience and sustainability of human and natural systems. Next slide please. And then economy and livelihoods programs, next slide please. Our natural resource and production area assessment and recovery planning, the need to promote green jobs and skills. In terms of local governance, we need to have improved forecasting tools, early warning systems, and their implications in terms of our local database development and monitoring. Likewise, need to highlight on localizing weather forecasting and early warning systems, and also knowledge sharing among LGUs, so that adaptation and preparedness to various disasters may be planned for. Next slide, please. And then other local governments, local governance concerns in capacitating LGUs, improving their access to financing, and improving cities' financial and regulatory facilities and capacities. Next slide, please. Okay. Therefore, I think we would have elaborated in those earlier slides what we hope are priority areas that could be picked up in your budgetary proposal preparation for fiscal year 2023. Now we go into the guidelines in the preparation of the PCB-RRP for 2023. First is we need to align the proposed POPs that we have with what are the priorities under the IATF, under the Water Secure and Resilient Philippines program, and the TFBB CRA implementation plans, and seek to see the agency's mandates and program expenditure classification that we have. Next. And then we need to also identify which among the following have potential PAPs that can be enrolled under the agency's existing POPs. Like, I think we had been able to copy all of the agencies of the cabinet cluster, the investment portfolio for resilience by the priority climate vulnerable provinces. We hope that you can pick up on those, look at them, and pick up what are areas not yet acted on there that we need to collectively work on at the cabinet cluster. We hope that you can pick up from the IATF priorities, from the priorities of working for water secure and resilient Philippines, from the key programs identified under the Task Force Build Back Better TFBB1 and TFBB2, from our need to green our COVID-19 response, our need to pursue green recovery programs, and the potential interventions identified linked to recovery and resilience investments. Next slide, please. We will have to accomplish the forms we have earlier given to our agencies. They are the PCB form number 1 and the BP form 202A, based on the POPs that we have identified. This will have to be submitted to the DNR as our RRP secretariat. And then the submissions should include a list of PAPs nominated for inclusion in the RRP. The submission may already be an existing PAP or an expanded one, a redesigned one, tier 1, and or a new POP or PAP for tier 2, aligned with the components identified in each of the investments. For tier 2 POPs, we are additionally reminded by the DBM that there are criteria that we have to comply. There are requirements by the DBM for new POPs together with the accomplished PCB forms. Next slide, please. And then the DNR will convene a technical review committee, a smaller subset of agencies from the cabinet cluster member agencies, to review the draft PCB form number 1 and the BP 202A forms, including their consistency and appropriateness in terms of the outcome and overall goal objectives of the CCAM-DRR roadmap, as earlier shared with us. As we convene the technical review committee, we will be submitting the findings and recommendations of the committee to the DNR, and any recommendations or findings there will be communicated by the DNR to the concerned participating agencies and provinces. And then, as you refine on your proposals and your forms from the TRC meeting, the concerned NGAs will have to resubmit to the DNR the revised PCB Form 1 and BP 202A, addressing the comments given by the Technical Review Committee. Next slide, please. And then the DNR will revise the Form 202A and present the proposed RRP set of consolidated programs to the cabinet cluster prior to endorsement by the chair to the DBM. And then the DNR as chair to the cluster will officially transmit to the DBM the consolidated submission of the RRP narrative, the forms that had been filled up by the agencies, and cluster resolution adopting the RRP. And then we will observe the timeline for review and submission of the proposals for 2023. Next slide, please. If there's need, next slide. How do we fill up the forms? If there's need for them. Next slide, please. In this, we will have to indicate the name of the agency filling up the form. That's the first blank there. We'll have to specify the proposed program, activity, or project under the first column. And then there are unified accounts code structure It is a government-wide harmonized budgetary treasury and accounting code anyway. Therefore, our financial people in our respective agencies would know this, and we will be guided by them. We will have to indicate the appropriate climate change typology for the proposed PAP using the National CCET Typology Code Manual as provided to us by the CCC. Number 5, we will have to classify the PAP according to the following and check the appropriate boxes. Are they an existing PAP, Tier 1? Is it a PAP existing that is for expansion? Is it an existing PAP for redesign? Is it a new PAP? Is the fourth box there. And then you will have to identify which of the following cluster roadmap outcomes the PAP supports. You will have to tick there. Is it supporting the increasing the resilience of vulnerable communities? Is it supporting the needing to ensure adequate supply of clean air, water, and other natural resources? Is the PAP supporting the enhancing of knowledge, access to information, and institutional capacities? And then we will identify which among the RRP key investment areas is the PAP supporting. That is what we have next in terms of the boxes. And then we will have to identify what climate and or disaster risk does the PAP address. Is it addressing typhoons? Is it addressing storm surge? Is it addressing flooding? Is it addressing drought or others? Please specify. And then you will have to link the outcomes to the CCAM-DRR roadmap, identify which RRP key investment area is the PAP supporting. And then you will have to, on the next page here, you will have to check the appropriate box. How is the PAP supporting any of the following? Is it linked to the RRP results framework? Is it using climate or disaster risk information? Is it on a climate resilient design feature of a proposed investment? And so on and so forth and so on, no, down the line of boxes. And then next is, although not required, you can rate your own PAP according to the criteria and proposal set by the DBM. This will help you determine if your certain PAP is a viable program that can be implemented. Will it stand high probability of being approved by the DBM? And then you'll have to specify the objectives of the PAP. And then you'll have to briefly describe the components of the PAP in terms of citing records of disasters, what had been climate projections, what are data sources that may be included in the PAP objective, how will the PAP address cited climate and disaster risk in the proposed geographic focus. Okay. And then you will have to identify who are the other agencies in the blank box here. You'll have to identify which of the other agencies are in the planning and implementation of the proposed PAP. You'll have to list down the proposed indicators, performance indicators for the PAP, and specify the corresponding accomplishments per year from 2021. You'll have to provide the proposed budget here from 2021 to 2026 and provide information being required. So this is for the first form, the PCB form number 1. Next form, please. For this BP202A, in here you'll have to indicate the cabinet cluster that submits this PAP, and it's our CCAM-DRR cabinet cluster. Second box of number 2, you'll have to specify the program title. Third box is you'll have to identify the concerned agencies who will implement this project. And then fourth box, you'll have to indicate the program description and its objectives. And then on number 5 here, you will put in the UWACS code of the PAP and provide the funding requirement from 2021 as already actually spent for, and 2022 onwards. For 2023, you'd have to specify budget under the Tier 1 and the Tier 2. And then you'd have to list down the performance indicators for the PAP and specify the respective inputs, respective targets and accomplishments for each indicator per year here under number 6. And then number 7, you have to identify the strategies and projects to achieve the targets. And then what are the proposed measures to address the related implementation issues or gaps in the PAP. Then provide the information of planning or budget officer and the approving person also within the agency. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, by way of a way forward in our timeline, next slide, please. First, we'll have to identify the viable RRP proposals for 2023 and submit the duly accomplished forms mentioned in Form 1 and BP 202A. Again, we just like to emphasize that we hope that they can consider the IPRR, priority areas that are not yet addressed, PFBB implementation plans, and other potential interventions linked to recovery and resilience investments. And then I think we need to continuously implement and monitor our ongoing RRP PAPs for the year, particularly those that have been approved by the DBM for 2022 General Appropriations Act. Next, this would comprise our timelines. And therefore, from here on, we would like to expect the agencies to submit accomplished PCB Forms 1 and BP 202A by March 15. After that, we will have to verify the submitted forms by April 6, and we will convene the Technical Review Committee, a smaller subset within the CCAM-DRR agencies, by April 15. And this meeting will look at the proposals also from the agencies, and whatever discussions we get from those, we will transmit to the respective concerned agencies, and then expected to be submitted to the DNR as chair to the cluster and as secretary to the RRP would be 2 signed hard copies of both forms, and this will have a deadline of April 25 to enable us to consolidate them, refine them, and the DNR as cluster chair will submit centrally to the DBM. Next slide, please. So in closing, I think what we want to see here is that collectively as cluster member agencies, we will be contributing to the implementation of a green, resilient, and sustainable recovery that requires taking key steps, including building mechanisms among us that can produce a lasting shift towards ecosystem resilience, implementing targeted policy interventions, and rationalizing our available financing to support these key concepts. I think it's been a long day for you. Yun lamang po. Maraming salamat.